Start. Okay. I think we're live, right?
I believe we're live.
All right. Cool. Thanks.
Right.
We're having technical difficulties today. Big apologies. Big apologies to everyone. Things that are beyond our control, but one day technology will be in our control, Matt.
Yeah.
Technology will be in our control. What is happening, Matt, to the practice of cooperation? This question gives us opportunity to transition into this next concept addressed in this chapter. What is happening to the practice of cooperation and even cooperation as a concept in a culture driven as it is by the alienating and exploitative and even the dividing capitalist automaton? In other words, up to now, we've had this discussion about the ways in which capitalism facilitates, the extraction of value from workers, and technology is ever seeking ways of cutting cost, or rather is used to cut cost for capital as history proceeds. And then this has as the immediate consequence, of course, of creating a surplus labor population, as we've just read in chapter 15. And then this, of course, has subsequent implications as far as diversification and the variety of opportunities that exist for society and for humanity more generally, of course, to contribute to its own cultivation, because, of course, capital is the one that's dictating production, and capital is the one that's dictating the channels and the rules of the game as far as production of commodities are concerned. So what is happening then to practices of cooperation and even cooperation as a concept, given that we are increasingly alienated from ourselves, isolated from other people, and then hyper exploited as the march of capitalism makes its way from one epoch onto the other? What do you think about this notion of cooperation?
Well, I mean, I think that we've talked a number of things. We talked about like the cyclical thing, and I wanted because we got lost sound. I do want to like really touch on that one thing about the regime of yoga and calisthenics and that. And that was, I want to be brief about it. Like I've been privy to situations where people who are being overworked, and then maybe the 40-hour work week could be argued to be overworked, but that's our standard, right? So I've seen people be demanded more of them than the standard, which is 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, right? I've seen people work for companies that are demanding more than that, and then the company turn around and say, make sure you're drinking enough water, make sure you're getting enough sleep, take care of yourself, even as they simultaneously make all kinds of demands of the worker. And so that kind of yoga regime, that kind of regime of self-care, the regime of the padded break room, I don't know what to call it. That kind of thing is very, very deeply ingrained in the workforce as it exists today. This kind of like, we're looking out for you, we care about you, sort of approach to the exploitation of labor is really big in our day and age. So I wanted to touch on that. But when you're talking about where's cooperation fit in all this, I think that first of all, you mentioned earlier the cycles. You're talking about the cyclical nature of like this boom bust kind of like overproduction that happens, and that is very true when we observe the 1800s and the 1900s and even late 1900s. But it's really becoming something else, because when you think about what Marx describes is this surplus army of labor that exists in these cyclical patterns. What we're looking at today are people who are not going to return to the workforce because they're not going to return to those industrial jobs. They're not going to return to the factory when the factory work returns because the factory work is not returning. Right, so that is qualitatively different. It's not just quantitatively different. It's not just decreasing numbers. It's qualitatively different. That factory job is never returning. Once the factory leaves, it's not coming back. Right. So you can say there's still factory work in the world. Yes, there is still factory work in the world. But once that factory leaves, and once that factory leaves due to automation, that factory is never returning. Right. And so that is the kind of thing that we're marching towards. And people say, well, you're saying this, but you're saying the future is not going to be jobs, and in the future this can happen, in the future and happen, in the future, in the future, in the future. The future is now. The future is now. You don't have the same type of workplace protections because of automation. You don't have the same type of security to get one job and then and that'd be the job for the next 30, 40 years because of automation. I was born in the future. Nobody told me. I was born in the opening years of the future, right? I was born in 81. So I'm born near the beginning of the future. The future is now. The reason we have a gig economy, the reason I was prepared to get 7 to 8 jobs, right? As a kid, they're telling me you're going to have 7 or 8 jobs over the course of your life, not like your parents. Well, the reason that happened is because of automation, and it's a really moral causal question, because what preceded that it's not because the capitalists got greedy. It's not because Reagan was any worse than let's say Herbert Hoover or Calvin Coolidge or anyone else. I mean, it's not any. It's because of the mode of production. It's because of the means of production. It's because of shifts in the means of production. Now, this doesn't happen all at once. Because that's the other thing. People think that people are very microwave brains, right? They think they want in an instant. Like you said, this happened, but I still see this, I still that, I still see that. Yeah, it's a process. It takes time. Right? We're reading Capital, right? First of all, it's a long process to read Capital, but second of all, Capital charts a very long process that took centuries to shape. The things that Karl Marx is writing about, he's writing about the view outside his window, but that view outside his window took 300 preceding years to be shaped. You know what I'm saying? He's writing about things that, he's writing about trees that were planted in the 1500s, and writing about it from the view in the 1800s. But that world that he's writing about didn't spring up overnight. And so when we're talking about that, when we're talking about the relationship workers have to their environment, to whatever, well, it depends what that environment is, right? Now, when we ask for a question of cooperation, well, the solutions in those days and the solutions in a pre-industrial world and the solutions of 10 people sitting around and 2 of them are exploiting the other 8, those don't change. The solution remains. You have to seize the means of production. You have to take over how things are distributed, how things are produced, and how they're distributed. You have to control that in a democratic fashion in which everyone has a say. That's the solution, and that's always the solution. That solution never changes. You could be arguing over a rock or a laser beam. It does not matter. That solution, that political struggle remains the same, and it's a struggle for popular power versus the power of the few to exploit the many.
Yeah. So that there's this, so that there's this culture of isolation and division that is promoted, and along the way, not only is it promoted, but it's practiced, and along the way, we are massaged and patted on the head, and led to believe that the same forces that are creating the conditions of our isolated and alienated and exploited existence are the very ones that are going to remedy our anxieties if we only, drink more water, if you will, and as you say, if we only eat right, as we're often told, if we do yoga, etc. Effectively, we're being placed, as you say, and I really like the metaphor. We're being placed in a padded room, right? So that we can bang ourselves, and we can be banged up against the wall without perceiving the pain. One of the things that is done in chapter 15. It's a tension that I think is really interesting. It gives us an opportunity to look at the promotion of liberal politics, not just the sort of liberal politics that we've been talking about this morning, not just out in society, but also the kind of liberal politics that we've been talking about as far as those liberal politics that exist within industry. And so in chapter 15, one of the really interesting things that is done is that Marx lays attention to different factory acts or legislation, right, that examines the ways in which factories would be regulated, and I underscore the adverb here, would, right, would be regulated such that the dangers that it presented to workers, the dangers that it presented to communities and to families, to children, right, would be curtailed, would be limited, but never, and this is one of the things that Marx makes very clear, never at an injury to capitalism. That is, that capital, everything is gauged in its relationship to the production of profit, to the production of surplus value, right? So I'd like to, at this point, I'd like to draw attention to a particular quote and share it with folks so that we can think about this discussion so far. It says, "We have seen how this absolute contradiction between the technical necessities of modern industry and the social character inherent in its capitalist form dispels all fixity and security in the situation of the laborer. How it constantly threatens, by taking away the instruments of labor, to snatch from his hands his means of subsistence, and by suppressing his detailed function, to make him superfluous. We have seen, too, how this antagonism vents its rage in the creation of a monstrosity, an industrial reserve army kept in misery in order to always be at the disposal of capital." And
this is what's really where this ties back into this question of how does it relate back to this question of the Chicanos, right? Of the Mexicans, right, living in the United States. And there is probably no other group of people more psychically tied in the American imagination to unskilled labor, to what's called unskilled labor, as Mexicans. Yeah. And what Marx is describing is the quote unquote de-skilling of labor. It is the removal of the specialty of the worker, right? And once the worker's specialty has been removed, they are more vulnerable to exploitation, right? If their skill is not something that can easily be, that cannot be just like picked off, right? Which is not to mean they don't have skills, which is not to mean they don't have specialized abilities. Everyone has specialized abilities, but the fact of the matter is that because they're going to be employed in a manner in which they're like, push this button, do this thing, pull this lever, walk down that mine, pull this out, right? Whatever it is, they can be more highly exploited. But now in the United States of America, we're talking about not some poor individual, some poor hapless individual who, through terrible and unfortunate circumstance, totally outside their control, has slipped into this precarious and terrible position. No, we're talking about an entire group of people. We're talking about a whole people. We're talking about, dare I say, a nation of people who have this stigma of unskilled labor swirling around them. Is the fetish of the concept of unskilled labor swirling around them, defining their existence in the country. And even when they quote unquote leave the world of unskilled labor into the world of skilled labor, they are questioned. What are you doing here? How did you get here? You don't belong here. This is bizarre. This is strange. You're so unique. you're so special. Oh my God, look at you, right? Whether it's a compliment or an insult, it's still this idea that you belong to a group of people who belong to this thing called unskilled labor, which defines, so thoroughly defines the Mexican experience within the United States, with particularly the Chicano experience within the United States. Because when you think about even like things that like, I mean, it seems kind of tangential, but this kind of concept of like a Mexican style boxing is seen as brutal and tough and gritty, but unskilled. Not he's your typical Mexican slugger, right? But this idea, whereas Mexico has the second largest collection of world champions in the history of the sport, right? And yet they're seen as unskilled labor because that idea that must be promoted, right? Which is very interesting, actually, because I mean, I'm kind of, this is an American thing, right? Because this is not globally understood that way, because there was this Japanese cartoon which shows Mexican boxer and he had a beautiful jab, and it was like, oh, Mexican boxers are such fine technicians, right? Such craftsmen. And then like in the Japanese, they got their own ideas too, so it was like they played like Spanish guitar, it was like a conquistador or something, I don't know, but like, so there's a different perception there, right? But this idea of like this lowly worker, this idea of this like this humble worker, this idea of this like this worker who will outwork everyone, but at the same time is very doesn't have the brains to do one thing or another. It is this concept that hounds and dogs us in this country.
Yeah. Well, from this,
what Marx is describing, he's describing something that happens to individuals and something that happens to maybe even sections of a town, sections of a city. But what his description of the things that happen to these unfortunate people and unfortunate groups of people in England, it can be expanded. It can be expanded and it can be used as a template to really understand the Chicano condition within the United States of America. It's a very useful tool to understand that, particularly these chapters.
Yeah. And so from this discussion, he returns to a critique of the capitalist system as a progenitor of cultural and intellectual mediocrity. And so he's laid the basis for us to understand, right, how it is that the cutting of cost and the standardization standardization of production and standardization of commodities, etc., how it leads to this very basic and very banal, if you will, level of interaction and cultural production and consciousness in society that corresponds and conforms to the interest of capitalism. He writes, it becomes a question of life and death, and he's talking about the ways in which this kind of conformity and this kind of correspondence is generated. He writes, it becomes a question of life and death for society to adapt to the mode of production, to the normal functioning of this law. Modern industry, indeed, compels society under penalty of death to replace the detail worker of today, crippled by lifelong repetition of one and the same trivial operation, and thus reduced to the mere fragment of a man. It's a mere fragment of a man by the fully developed individual, fit for a variety of labors, ready to face any change of production, and to whom the different social functions he performs are but so many modes of giving free scope to his own natural and acquired powers. So that the human being is not functioning for his own or for her own interest. The human being is functioning in the interest of a capitalist system that would have him or have her do this, that, and the other at any particular whim or at any particular capitalist need. And I've been thinking about this, because what he does in this particular chapter, as he looks at the impact of capital systems of production on individuals and on the deadening and the commodification even of the intellect. He examines, in this particular chapter, he examines the printing industry and notes that prior to the introduction of what was then advanced technology, literacy was a requirement for employment in that trade, right? And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to draw attention to a particular quote that gives us an opportunity to examine this particular understanding. He says, to qualify them, and he's talking about young boys who were channeled into this particular industry, to qualify them for the work which they have to do, they require no intellectual training. There is little room in it for skill and less for judgment. Their wages, though rather high for boys, do not increase proportionately as they grow up, and the majority of them cannot look for advancement to the better paid and more responsible post of machine minder, because while each machine has but one minder, it has at least 2 and often 4 boys attached to it. As soon as they get too old for such child's work, that is about 17 at the latest, they are discharged from the printing establishments. They become recruits of crime. And so what I'd like to note here, as he's talking about, the mediocritization of the labor force, and as he's talking about the ways in which cooperation has been subverted, what I'd like to note is, in this particular case, really what he's giving us an opportunity to consider is the ways in which capitalism and its socializing forces contribute to the imprisonment and the prison industry of 19th century England. And there is opportunity for us to begin to understand, right, prison industry and prison culture, the prison economy in contemporary society, especially as far as Chicano and Chicana workers are concerned. At least this is especially an interest for us, given the scope of the work that we've been doing over these last months, which is attentive to the experiences of Chicana and Chicano workers, but also other workers with whom they are socialized. And in a place like the LA metropolitan region, the other workers with whom Chicanas and Chicanos are socialized are certainly Central American origin people, are certainly African American people, right? That our socialization in our schools, in our workplaces, and our exclusion from contributing to our own cultivation, our exploitation and our isolation from one another and our alienation contributes to what folks in the education field call the school to prison pipeline. I wonder if you might share some thoughts about this, Matt. Can't hear you.
I think the thing that's most like on most people's minds right now, when it comes to prison labor, is the recent California wildfires and the employment of prison labor in order to address it. And so I think that in many ways this recent election really showed how different California is from the rest of the country, and there could be a definite argument made that California really should go the way, become an independent nation state. Because if you look at like, California alone essentially accounts for the difference in the popular vote between Biden and Trump. So, and that was actually even more true last time. It was actually more than that. So, in many ways, California is a different kind of country than the United States of America, but it's still a shitty country. I mean, even if it were its own country, like it's a place that employs prison labor to do that. So, there's like kind of like if the United States is like those who embrace reaction versus those who are lulled to sleep by soothsayers, California would fall into that lulled to sleep by soothsayers category, right? As opposed to like those who compose a bloodthirsty mob, this would be more of a hypnotized mob. But this kind of this kind of use of prison labor, it makes it all the more insidious, right? Because it's like one of the, by American standards, one of the less reactionary places, and yet this is still something that goes on, right? We're going to use it just shows just how structural it is, right? Yeah. Just how structural the use of prison labor is, just how structural the what do you call it, the exemptions for let's say workers in the field for agricultural work, the exemptions to labor law. So like these things where if capital demands something, it's going to happen no matter how egregious and disgusting it is, and it's going to happen in the so-called liberal states as well. It'll happen in California, one of the more liberal states in these 50 states, right? It's still going to happen here. So that shows you just how structural the thing is, just how just normal it is, just what we find normal, the things that we don't find to be an aberration, the things that we find to be normal. And I think that in our time, prison labor is really just seen as a pillar of the economy. Yeah. It's part of our yoga culture. Yeah. Prison labor, yoga, all the same.
One of the things that I think about as one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading for today's discussion is his attention to the ways in which capitalism, breeding as it does poverty, how it is that poverty then has the consequent impact on the life chances and opportunities of people, and opportunities particularly to make a living, excluded and extracted as people are from opportunities to be members and deciding members of various industries, to the extent that capital monopolizes industrial production, right? The children of working families or the children of working classes, he says, right? He says, become recruits of crime. They become recruits of crime. And I was thinking to myself, as I was thinking about today's talk, what I did is I got on the internet and I did some searches. And one of the searches that I did was concerning the average income of so-called Hispanics, the average income of so-called Hispanics prior to their incarceration. And I came across the, and I have it here on the screen as a matter of fact. Here it is. I came across the Prison Policy Initiative, and I discovered that prior to the incarceration of these people that are called Hispanic, and I say this, tongue in cheek, prior to their incarceration, this is from data drawn from about 5 years ago that was posted on this particular website. The average income prior to the incarceration of so-called Hispanic men was just under $20,000 a year. The average income for so-called Hispanic women prior to their incarceration was just under $12,000 $100,000. And so thinking about, right, how it is that the circumstances of poverty, right, entrapped as people are in poverty, how it may in fact contribute to their channeling, right, into their imprisonment, into their forced labor within the prison industrial complex. As far as Black men are concerned, they were making about $17,500 a year, and Black women were making just under $13,000 a year. Again, these aren't salaries that are what we would call middle class salaries by any means, even 5 years ago, certainly not 5 years ago. And so that entrapped as people are in poverty, caught as they are by the circumstances and the conditions of poverty, they are more hyper surveilled, hyper observed, and then are tracked and channeled into imprisonment than are folks from other economic sectors. And then I thought also about their educational attainment prior to their incarceration. And I bring this up because, of course, I was thinking about the analysis that Marx lays on the printing industry and how one could, at that time, be a worker producing text, as of all things, without having to be literate. That is, irony of ironies. And I discovered, right, in this particular, in this other website, and this one is drawn from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So this is literally taken from the United States government statistics in terms of its prison population. And although this data is somewhat dated, it is still useful because it gives us an understanding of the ways in which not just the circumstances of poverty, the entrapment in poverty leads to the channeling of folks to prison, but also the commodification of children's intellect and their use in order to extract exchange value as they are coming up the educational system, right? How it is this mediocrity contributes to their own imprisonment down the road for some of these folks. It says here, the educational attainment for state and federal prison inmates in 1997 and 1991, local jail inmates 1996 and 1989, probationers 1995, and the general population 1997. And I'd like to focus on prison inmates here. It says in 1997, about 14% of prison inmates had 8th grade or less. 25.5% had some high school. 28.5% had a GED. So if you add these first numbers, if you just add these up themselves, right, that means that roughly 70% of prison inmates in 1997 had not completed high school, right? Let alone there's no information here as far as the reading level of folks who were in prison in 1997. And I'm thinking now about the ways in which capitalism not only breeds isolation, not only breeds alienation, not only facilitates the exploitation of workers, but capitalism breeds a conformity and breeds a mediocrity that in fact is consumed by capitalism itself again. In other words, you know, this superfluous population, this excess population that isn't integrated and isn't incorporated into capitalist systems of production is still fodder for the capitalist system itself, is still consumed by capitalism, and is used for the generation of, you know, of prison labor, the generation of prison labor up in the hills during the fire season, etc. You know, this is a terrible and horrible situation in which working classes and specifically the hyper exploited ones find themselves. Children, about your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that what you're describing is a constant, but if you look at the rise of the prison population, again, this does not explode until the late 1970s. Around the same time, the microchip enters into factory production.
Yeah.
I mean, like the explosion in homelessness, the explosion in personal debt, the explosion in the prison population, the explosion in the kind of explosion of what you can expect from the economy. You look at how much less wealth the millennials have in, say, the baby boomers, and that's something that's constantly studied. I think what's lost in that mix, though, is if you look at what happens to Generation X, right? If you look at Generation X, it actually, they lose from the boomers, and the millennials have even less than them, and whereas to follow the millennials will have even less than that. So, I mean, I think that you know, when we're talking about the trajectory of the economy, it really is a downward spiral, and it's not going to get better. It's not like this like cyclical thing that's going to improve. As you know, when I spoke earlier about cycles, I wasn't saying that to say, well, this is not really cyclical, blah blah blah, in order to like make the situation seem rosier. It's actually much worse than that. It's actually much more grim than that, because cycle would imply that it's going to get better again. Because like, well, look at the boomers. There's going to be like another age of boomers, right? There's going to be some kind of post where we're at right now, rebound.
Yeah.
For like it may have been rough for a couple of generations, but this next generation got better. No, it's going to get worse. The industrial economy replaced by the gig, replaced by the service economy, replaced by the gig economy, to be replaced by the scrounge economy, to replace by the vulture economy, just to be replaced by the scavenger economy, to be replaced by the what I'm saying, it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, the solution remains the same, which is to seize the means of production. So I mean, I think that it doesn't matter whether we're talking about picking up a giant automated factory where no human labor is required, or you're talking about a water mill. The solution does not change. So when we ask about prisons, though, I mean, the explosion of prison population, you can't look at you can't. I mean, there's no way to not tie that to the general economic trends since the late 1970s, because that's when they began to explode. In the late 1970s, there was something like 500,000 prisoners, right?
Yeah.
And it just increased from in the reigning years to 1 million by the end of his term. By the end of Bush, it was at 1.3. And by the end of Clinton, it was creeping up in the 2 million mark, and then subsequent Bush Jr. and Obama, they brought it up to 2.5. Between the two of them, and it kind of stabilized there, and maybe it's going down a little bit, it's going back up a little bit, but it's kind of stabilizing at 2.5. But we'll see. Like if these trends continue, it'll probably go up to 3, and it'll just keep going up and up and up and up. And so, around the same time, you see explosion in the rate of homelessness. I mean, that was I forget exactly how much it's increased, but it's increased, at roughly the same pace. And then you see the explosion of student debt, which has exploded incredibly, just by numbers. It's up like tenfold, right? So and personal debt, personal credit card debt, has also exploded at relatively the same rate. So this is all tied. This is all tied back to a shift in the means of production. Because not to say that things were bad before. It's not to say that they weren't exploited before. People, working in the factories, getting their hands lopped off. I mean, it wasn't good. It was different. And this system where they don't need you is different. So under those conditions, you're going to see things like, the mass expansion of prisons, but you're also going to see the privatization of prisons, right? You're also going to see the privatization of schools. You're also going to see all these little things that are looking to take what was basically the infrastructure required to reproduce capitalism, right? So this giant infrastructure, this social infrastructure, like education, like the workers need to know how to read to do this thing, right? We need these roads to get this thing across. All that giant infrastructure that came out of the public coffers, right? You're going to see that because those workers are not as necessary as they once were. So now it's not really a matter of, well, we really need to do this and this is an expense, but to hell with it, we'll just do it because it's just the cost of doing business. Well, that cost of doing business is vanishing from the face of the earth. So they're going to start closing down schools. They're going to start doing these things, and just and live with it. That's going to be the mantra of the future. And there's going to be people who are nice about it. Like the typically will represent the Democratic Party, or pretend to be nice about it, and they'll say things like, well, these are hard times. We'll have to tighten up our belt. I weep when I think of these schools closing, and we're gonna do right by these people, and we're gonna do right by these kids, and there's nothing more sacred than a blah 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 blah. And then they close down the school, right? Then there's gonna be like the Republican side, which can basically say like, these schools are failing. They're failing our children. It's the teacher's fault. It's your fault. It's the kids' fault. These are criminals. Blah blah blah. And they're gonna be all like, all gung ho about it. And everyone's gonna be like, oh my God, we better get the Democrats in because they're gonna come in and they're gonna save the day. And then they're gonna say we're gonna save the day, and then they come in and they're gonna do the exact same thing. So that is exactly how this good cop bad cop game is gonna work. But there's a reason they're closing down schools, and it has nothing to do with the good or the bad cop. They're just facilitating it. They were good and bad. They were playing good and bad cop for centuries. And they were playing good and bad cop under different sets of circumstances. They're playing good and bad cop when there was plenty of work, when there was more jobs than people. They were playing good and cop, bad cop back then. So that is not to be confused with why this is happening. Why this is happening is the technological shift, and there's really no other reason for it. And so, but the good news is that the solution remains the same. We've got to seize the means of production.
I'm caught by his attention in this particular chapter to the ways in which futures are gambled. Futures are put, and of course here I'm talking about the futures. I'm talking about the future lives of people. In this case, the future lives of working class children that are increasingly exploited in the 19th century, 19th century industrial capitalism in England. And also thinking then about the ways that he sees the function and the consequence of capitalist culture in the lives of young people socialized within its economic system. It tracks them when it does not injure them first. And then certainly there is no escape. It tracks them within continual cycles of work and poverty, such that children not only acclimate to the conditions of their existence as adults, but effectively provide its source of value for as long as they live, however short those lives might be. Such is the conditioning that they literally become, and I'm talking about children, such is their conditioning that they literally become the soldiers of capitalism. We're at the tail end, Matt, of our talk this morning, fractured as the talk has been by the lack of cooperation from technology. Matt, would you provide some poetic synthesis? Would you draw attention to the ways in which children today and the adults who they will be tomorrow are put on the gambling table, were put on the gambling table in the past, and are put on the gambling table today. Would you say something to that regard? Can't hear you. Can't hear you. Can hear you now.
I grew up on television, so did my parents. I love Lucy, live and sweet. The American redhead, desire, suppressed, and separate bed sensors. Rest assured, everything in good taste, everything in its proper place. Every traumatic episode ends with the threat of Ricky's hand over far from Lucy's face, beaming in glorious black and white. Wrong and right plot lines, shade out the gray, and John Wayne shining silver city on a hill of guns and butter. Every school child's desk doubles as bomb shelter, praying to the altar in question. To pledge your allegiance. Lock your doors and seal your documents because you're free to, and lock and load your freedom because it is not free. Now fall to your knees and praise be to the only God in which you trust, the atom, the Manhattan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the nuclear family, nuclear testing, nuclear age gave way to nuclear waste. That's me. See, I grew up in the 80s. Morning in America. Ronald Reagan and Mr. Belvedere fleshing my door to my life was more than mere survival. But I lived a good life yet when my time came. Homer Simpson, Peter Griffin, Al Bundy were all lying in wait to convince me that I could raise a family, two-story on the single income of a shoe salesman. They lied. And I cry. Not for myself as oncoming generation of iPad kids on the Hulu and Netflix where you pick your poison, but it rots your mind. Just the same, see them at cafes, sipping, job seeking, asking the net for deeper meaning. Who am I? Where do I belong? What use can I be in days such as these? Kids born of go-go gadgets, wires, networks connected. The Rex Lays trans-surf the web in search of themselves, no different from evil surfs when the buzz the Catholic Church lists holy writ, holy script, holy this since the golden rule. Pharaohs and Caesars, Romulus and Remus, Akbar and Alexander, Xerxes and Hammurabi, since the days of scribes and the books of kings, since they from on high convinced us down below that we ever needed their code of law to tell us we were free.
That last line reminds me of a discussion that I had with my son when he was young, very young. And I asked him if, I told him about Nat Turner, and I asked him if Nat Turner was born free, if he was free. Anyway, I'll leave you with that question. I'll leave folks with that question, and I'll ask folks to think about. Will you repeat those last few lines of that about the code?
It says, since they from on high convinced us down below that we ever needed their code of law to tell us we were free.
All right. Very thought-provoking. Thank you so much, Matt. Sorry folks for the difficulties we've had, and we'll see you next week. We'll be.
By the way, I think there's things on right now.
Our talk is on right now.
No, Alejandro, I think is on right now.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna check. I'm gonna check them out. Right. And then also the talk that we have with Lupe, Guadalupe.
And Raul, yeah. When's that on?
Yeah.
What time's it on?
I think it's Wednesday. I think our talk is on Wednesday. We'll be on. But anyway, I'll post it and we'll get the word out. Okay.
All right.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.